let's go through the things that might help boost growth. And one is trade. And clearly, if Brexit was damaging for UK growth, then some sort of tightening of relations with the European Union would presumably be helpful for European growth. Why is the Prime Minister, or why is this country so unwilling to push harder for a closer relationship when that presumably would help boost the economy?
I think PTSD, basically. Brexit for the political system in the UK was effectively a heart attack. The polling went wild. You had 3 years of just sort of screaming at each other in Westminster. Nobody really wants to go back with that. But voters have really sort of moved on. The idea of a closer relationship with the EU is completely, utterly uncontroversial among a big majority of British citizens and among a huge majority of Labour voters. So politically, there simply isn't really a domestic issue when it comes to moving closer to the EU. So then it becomes just a much more sort of technocratic problem of how you actually get there.
And do you think when Prime Minister Starmer talks about, doing things iteratively, do you think this will actually add up to much in this term of this Parliament or not?
In short, no, but I don't think we'll be in this position in 3 years' time. I think come 28, 29, when Starmer has to appeal to this liberal progressive bloc of voters that make up his base, he's going to start wrapping himself in an EU flag. So I really wouldn't be surprised if those red lines became a bit pink or even sort of rubbed out altogether.
Of all the manifesto sort of promises to break, this feels like a really sensible one if you look at the polling. If you look at sort of support among Labour members, voters for closer cooperation, I completely agree with you.
And there are so few policy areas where the relatively straightforward option is politically popular, free, and would make the country sort of richer. That's a very, very powerful combo, and they don't often exist. Like, it's the closest thing Keir Starmer has to £50 on the pavement.
And on the PTSD point, I think there's a real still a misunderstanding of what Brexit was, why people voted Brexit. It wasn't because of the shape of bananas and regulation and stuff like that. It was migration, in my opinion. It was largely migration point.
So we'll come on to that in a second, but I'm just looking at Ed, whose brows are furrowing ever more. Do you buy this idea from our two Britain colleagues?
Well, what worries me is that as this prize hoves into view, Europe itself becomes less functional, so it becomes worth less. I mean, if we have a President Bardella in 2027, not much is happening in Europe, in my view.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, there could be a really unfortunate overlap that just as PTSD has got over and British politicians, want to get much closer, there is chaos on the other side and they won't get much closer. Let's talk about the big area that reform clearly has made its own, which is that of immigration. And Sasha, you focused on this closely, and I wanted you to talk our viewers through what actually has been going on, because I think there is quite a lot of misunderstanding of what's actually been happening in the UK. So maybe you could set the scene and then we can talk about whether this is something that will help or hurt the Prime Minister.
Okay, let me bring up some charts. I'll be quick, I promise. So this is the big one. What you see here is from 2021, you see net migration quite suddenly really going up after a little COVID dip, which is where we start in 2020. And this is a mix of things. It's partly Hong Kong visas and refugees from the war in Ukraine, but it is largely what we now call the Boris wave, which comes as Brexit is officially implemented in January 2021. And you have a new migration rules, essentially, that are quite liberal for non-EU migrants, so particularly care workers and foreign students. And it shoots up, as you can see. I mean, this is very, very high migration numbers. If we're talking about why people are angry and upset, that's really very big. Anyway, so that goes on for a few years, and then you see it to start to come down, mostly in 24, with big drop, actually, to be fair, as those kind of, partly the things I mentioned before stop, but also as migration rules tighten, specifically on working visas with wage limits, as well as foreign students. Now, if you go to the second chart really quickly, what this shows, though, so in general, net migration goes down, but what goes up is asylum claims and, next chart, please, small boat arrivals. The next chart shows small boat arrivals, and this is the thing people really think about and care about when they think about migration. Although this is a fairly small chunk of the first chart, it is going in the wrong direction, particularly asylum claims, which are at their highest. And those are the things people are, I think, very upset about, and that's underappreciated.
The reason I think this is fascinating is because you had this absolute surge of the Boris wave. And even though now that's come down very much, because you have fast-growing small boat arrivals, you have a sense of lack of control over borders. And for our American viewers, this is, I think, very redolent of the nature of the debate in the US, which leads me, Ed, to ask you whether you think if net migration stays at these lower levels, still high, frankly, 200,000 a year, but much lower than they were, does this issue retain the salience it has for the British public?
I'd like to think that it begins to die away, but I worry that migration has become this it sort of stands in for general discontent. The government's not working. Public services aren't good enough. It's a too long queue to get to see your GP if you're not feeling very well. And that for as long as those things don't really work, people blame migration. But I happen to think that if you've got a growth agenda, you need to encourage migration, particularly high-skilled migration. And I really worry that in trying to deal with the boats, you end up squeezing out the people who would contribute most to the economy.
Without stopping the boats.
Without stopping the boats.
So Duncan, what do you think? Because what's your pithy advice to the government on what they should do and what they should focus on? Should they sound tough on migration? What's your analysis?
In terms of migration numbers, I think they should just take the win. So migration numbers have come crashing down. They've gone from about 800,000 to about 200,000. And it happened on Starmer's watch. I will put that on a placard and march around with it and saying, look, we do have control. We said we would bring down immigration, and we have. I think there is a lot of politics that people can do on this topic. And I think I do think public opinion will shift as well. If we do have a few years of close to potentially net zero migration, I think public opinion will shift very quickly. And that brings back to something I was saying before about the shifts on the red lines with the EU, one of which was free movement. So in 3 years' time, if you've had zero or even sort of negative migration, I think people would be really willing to have a discussion about free movement.